So in today's video, I'm talking about what is codependency and understanding codependent relationships. Because if you can do that, you can create healthy ones. But first, if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships that work. So what is codependency? Codependency is basically a pattern of behavior where you overly focus on others in order to get love in return. So this could be helping, giving too much, over-functioning in relationships, rescuing others from their pain and problems, because that's how you feel needed. When we struggle with codependency, our whole focus is outward on other people because we don't have a solid sense of self. And so this actually creates issues of low self-esteem, inability to take care of ourselves or set boundaries. And it also creates a very unhealthy dependency in our relationships. That feeling, you complete me, becomes our mantra. If you relate at all to being codependent, say me too in the comments. I'm right there with you. So when you struggle with codependency in relationships, you are doing most of the giving. You're putting 110% into the relationship, while the other person typically is the taker and they are giving a lot less. You're probably the one initiating contact more. You're probably the one that's super supportive and there for that other person, but you find that they're not necessarily there for you in the same way. Often this is because we attract people who are narcissistic, somewhat self-centered, alcoholic or addicts, people who tend to have a lot of problems and need rescuing. So they're not really emotionally available for us. And as codependents, we tend to overdo because we think we have to in order to be loved. Just giving moderately isn't enough. We have to overextend ourselves and give 110%, whereas the normal healthy person understands that they don't have to do that in order to be loved. So when we struggle with codependency, we really get our value from what we do, not who we are. We get our value from being helpful to others. We get our value and our self-esteem from doing and helping others, not being who we are. In fact, we often feel like we're not enough because our self-esteem is low. We also have trouble trusting ourselves. We assume other people have our answers. But here's the thing, codependency is not a one-size-fits-all problem. There's so many signs and symptoms, and I'm going to help you understand what those are in a minute, but that's what makes it confusing. For instance, some people are really good at advocating for themselves even though they're codependent. They have more of a domineering type of personality, whereas other people relate to being the doormat. They're never going to say no because they're afraid to, or they want to avoid conflict at all costs. Because there is no typical codependent behavior. There are certain traits that you're going to learn in this video, but not every person who is codependent has them all. You may relate to having a lot of the symptoms or very few, and that's why codependency can be so easy to miss. So what causes codependency? It's basically when you grow up in a family where your needs aren't met because the adult's problems overshadow the child's needs. When we have codependency in our relationships, we typically come from families where there's some type of dysfunction. Maybe you had a parent or a family member who was alcoholic or an addict, or they had very little coping skills and they were a rageaholic, or there was some form of depression, anxiety, or mental illness that really overshadowed their ability to parent. These are the things that help to create codependency because what we learn as children is to be seen and not heard. We learn to take care of others and neglect ourselves because our parents or our caregivers don't have the energy to take care of us. Because let's face it, taking care of a child is a huge responsibility. And codependency also develops when you have caregivers that are physically or emotionally unavailable to you. So you're left to fend for yourself. The child doesn't learn that their needs or wants are really okay. They actually learn the opposite. You may totally disregard your needs or wants for the sake of other people because that's how you learn to cope and get love and approval in your family. Or maybe one of your relatives was codependent and they passed on those behaviors to you because that was your role model. Also, you can be codependent with anyone, a friend, a mate, a coworker, a boss, your child. These patterns can impact all of our relationships, but again, it looks different on every person. So there are 5 main areas where codependency really impacts you. The first one is your relationships. When we're codependent, we tend to attract people who are toxic. We tend to attract people who are narcissistic or alcoholic or tend to have a lot of problems. So the relationship ends up being one-sided. My dysfunctional patterns of codependency relate all the way back to childhood when I didn't know how to make friends. So I used codependent behaviors like people-pleasing, giving people gifts, sacrificing who I was for others so that I could try to make a friend because I didn't have good friendship skills. So my relationships became dysfunctional from a really early age. You may find that your codependency is primarily showing up in your romantic relationships, where you sacrifice yourself, or you're giving up who you are for that other person, or you're sacrificing really important values because you have to stay in that relationship because that's the only way you can feel loved. Also, you may look to your relationships to make you happy versus being able to do that for yourself. And that can keep you in toxic relationships instead of being able to let go of them. The second way codependency in relationship impacts you is our self-esteem. Often we have low self-esteem because we're so focused on getting our approval and our needs met outside of ourselves that we really haven't spent any time or know how to actually cultivate a relationship with ourselves. So as a result, we look to other people for our answers. We don't trust ourselves and our intuition. Another thing that happens is you may compare yourself to others a lot, or you're really hard on yourself and you can't let go of the mistakes you've made. You obsess about it over and over in your mind because you just can't let it go. You're much more forgiving to other people than you are yourself, and that's because issues of low self-esteem are really inherent part of codependency. The next area that codependency really impacts is our ability to let go and trust ourselves and trust other people. When we struggle with codependency in relationships, we often have issues of control, where we are going to try to control our environment, because often we grew up not having control over what was said or done to us or in our family. So we see control as a means of staying safe. We try to force things to go our way because we think that's the only way we're going to be okay. We may not trust that other people really care about us, so we overextend and do way too much for them because we think we have to prove our love instead of really accepting that we are already loved for who we are. If you relate to this at all, say me too in the comments. I'm right there with you. We may find ourselves telling others what they should be doing, how they should be living their life. We're really good at giving advice. Not necessarily because we think we're better than, but we think we have their answer because we want to be helpful. I know for me in the past, I've given advice that was not asked for because I wanted to be helpful. And this may cause people to start separating and distancing themselves from us, which can be really painful. Another aspect of how codependency impacts us is our ability to set healthy boundaries and say no. Because most of us who struggle with codependency in our relationships are people pleasers. We want to please others far more than even pleasing ourselves. So we will say yes, we will overextend, we will help even though it's inconveniencing us big time. Because we want that love and approval, and we think that if we set boundaries and say no, people are going to be upset. People might leave us or get mad at us. I have spent years not setting boundaries simply because I thought the other person was going to get mad at me. When I finally actually started saying no and setting boundaries, I found that the other person actually didn't care. They were totally fine with it. I was making up all these negative assumptions in my head that actually weren't true. So the next area where codependency has a major impact on us is our ability to manage emotions. Because in codependency, we're very focused on other people, and we almost see them as our only solution, so we don't have ways to self-soothe and to cope with stress. Because in order to do that in a healthy way, you have to have a healthy connection to yourself. You have to be willing to sit in your own pain or your own discomfort and feel the feelings. And part of what's really difficult when you're codependent is that you feel other people's feelings much more than you do your own. So in some ways, we actually can't tolerate feeling our own pain because we're so overloaded feeling somebody else's. And often this goes back to childhood, where you maybe learned how to ignore your own feelings and your own pain because you weren't comforted or told that it was okay to feel sad. You had to pretend everything was okay when it isn't. So in our adult relationships, we tend to take things personally a lot. even when they're not about us. You may find that you're very sensitive or easily triggered because you don't know how to manage emotions. So we learned that it wasn't okay to have our feelings. So in adulthood, we actually learn to pretend that everything is okay even when it isn't. So here's a quick checklist for you on signs of codependency and codependent relationships. You neglect your own needs for someone else's. You go to great lengths to please others because you need that validation and support, and you can't give it to yourself. You have a lot of difficulty setting boundaries or saying no, especially if you think it's going to harm someone. You go to great lengths to avoid conflict because you don't want to upset people, or you assume that they're going to be mad at you if you bring something up. You have difficulty identifying your wants and needs. You tend to attract people who have a lot of problems or need rescuing. You're not able to end relationships no matter how toxic they are. You feel taken advantage of a lot in your relationships, but you can't do anything differently. Your happiness depends on what others think of you, and you're really hard on yourself. Now, I know this is not an easy list to look at, so please don't beat yourself up if you relate to any or all of these traits, because the first sign of codependency recovery is a willingness to say, yes, this does apply to me. That's your starting point in your recovery. Now, the next step I want you to do is go watch my video on how to recover from codependency. Thanks so much.